Hollywood in Toto podcast. Entertainment news and reviews without the woke Hollywood narrative. Free speech, free expression. Now that's entertainment. And here's your host, award-winning film critic, Christian Toto.
This week on the Hollywood in Toto podcast, we ask why Showtime got cold feet about the latest media attack on Governor Ron DeSantis. We speak with podcaster Michael McGruther about why he thinks cancel culture victims too often walk headfirst into the fire. And we talk with Caylan Ford, whose political campaign collapsed thanks to a nasty, unfounded cancel culture broadside. She's fighting back with a new film, and it might be the most consequential documentary since What is a Woman? Well, Showtime beclowned itself a year or two ago, airing the Comey Rule. Now, why would I say that? Kind of harsh. The miniseries went into production after the Mueller report failed to show that President Trump colluded with Russia to steal the 2016 presidential election. Oops. Yet the film carried on as if that report and subsequent headlines never happened. It pretended the collusion narrative was real, true, and scary, and a threat to our democracy. It's fake news, the movie. On with the show, right? Well, Showtime has yet to apologize, especially after the Durham report just absolutely destroyed any credibility anyone has about the Russian collusion situation. No harm, no foul, though, right? It's just showbiz. Well, now Showtime is back, and their Vice program is backpedaling a bit. They had planned an episode around Governor Ron DeSantis, and specifically his time working at Guantanamo Bay Prison. The episode was called The Gitmo Candidate and Chipping Away. Kind of an odd title. And it looked at accusation that he oversaw torture at that particular facility when he was a JAG back in the day. Now, the White House hopeful already completely shredded that narrative, I thought effectively so, in a pretty testy exchange with a reporter. Take a listen.
Who said that?
Detainees have told us that.
How would they know me? Okay, think about that. Do you honestly believe that's credible? So this is 2006. I'm a junior officer. Do you honestly think that they would have remembered me from Adam? Of course not. They're just trying to get into the news because they know people like you will consume it because it fits your preordained narrative that you're trying to spin. Focus on the...
So why did Showtime pull the episode? Is it going to air at a later date? Maybe they were thinking it could inflict more harm on his candidacy a few months later as opposed to right now. You never know. But why not air a hit piece against the GOP darling? I mean, it's what the media does. Why bother even waiting? You could revisit it. You could expand upon it, perhaps. The facts don't really matter, do they? Well, maybe they realize just how wafer-thin the accusations are. Or, and this is my theory, they know that Team DeSantis is going to fight back and pretty hard over any attack like this. President Trump routinely battled the press, fought back against unfair headlines, but he always lacked the discipline to do it right. Listen, give him a lot of credit for fighting back in the first place. Most Republicans don't dare. I think that's changing, and partly thanks to Trump basically leading the way in this regard, but he didn't have the facts at his disposal where he could really dissect why this particular story was fair, unfair, or incorrect, or something along those lines. And by the way, I don't think Trump said a word about the Comey Rule, the Showtime miniseries. And if he didn't, he should have. That's a mistake. That's not the way DeSantis operates, at least not up till now. Now, I have to wait and see how this all plays out, but for now, Showtime might have avoided another self-inflicted wound on its wobbly brand. Just maybe, but I have a feeling they'll be back. I admit, professionally speaking, I spend way too much time talking about cancel culture, both here and, of course, on my website, hollywoodintoto.com. But I have no regrets. I mean, I wish it would go away. I'm praying it goes away. But until the time it actually does, we need to expose it. We need to make as many people as possible understand why it's so toxic to the culture. But a fellow conservative has a different idea or different philosophy regarding cancel culture. He thinks the victims often bring it on themselves. Not always, but sometimes. So I decided to bring him on the show, and he could share his side of the story. His name is Michael McGruther, and he's the host of the Narrative Podcast. And he has some complex thoughts on not just this subject, but the overall culture. And he doesn't mind throwing some sharp elbows around on his side of the aisle. Risky stuff, I get it, but his comments made me question some of my thoughts, And I think he may make you rethink some of your positions on certain topics as well. And if not, I think it's just a good conversation. Here's my chat with Michael McGruther. Michael, thanks for joining the show. And I wanted to start with the most loaded term in our culture right now, which we're supposedly not allowed to define, or we can't define, or it's too amorphous, or if you define it, you're a bad person. It's woke. And, it's funny. A friend of mine teased me about I've been using the word too much. And I think it's both important to use and also something that is overused. And I don't want to be that person. But how would you define it? And you can do it in a word or a sentence or a paragraph, because it ain't easy, but it is complicated. So how do you rein it in?
Well, I'll simply call it what it is. It's a MacGuffin. We live in a narrative-driven world, and the narrative pulls you into it. And when you get pulled into the narrative, you have to accept all of the fake realities that are created through the story that we're all participating in. So, what's woke? It's really, I made a whole podcast episode about it and sent it to you. I really think it's simply a corporate way to get rid of expensive contracts. And then it just gets weaponized by all the sub players who, don't know what they're doing, but they're given hot lava and they just throw it at each other. And it turns into this like orgy almost of cancel culture, fetishes, and just nonstop going off about it. But if we keep going after it, we make it stronger. If we just ignore it, it will go away. So that's my long answer of what's woke.
That's okay. And just to jump in, we may disagree on some things, but what you said about corporations and the excuse, it immediately made me think of Megyn Kelly, who was under this massive contract. Her show was not performing like they expected. And then when she made some idle conversation about Halloween costumes and blackface, and it was a very innocuous comment, they pounced and seized and got rid of her, but they were looking for they wanted to get her off the payroll, and I'm sure they paid her quite a bit just to cut ties. But that was a great example of exactly what you're saying. Now, here's the provocative thing that you said to me offline, which I want to bring obviously on this conversation. You said in 99% of the cancel culture victims that we look at, it's often that they walked into it and then got canceled, almost like it was premeditated in a way. That was the way I took your comment, but break that down a bit for me.
Well, as I said before, everything that we're talking about involves a story that you and I both relate to through social media. And that story, we intersect and we understand this kind of false reality that we're telling each other about ourselves. And in that story, some people get so motivated to be very, very bad actors, bad versions of themselves trying to reach a goal, usually because they've also been encouraged to be, ideologically immovable or something. There's some nudge. I call it the dark nudge. I think people who are Christians know that there's a good nudge and there's a dark nudge. And the dark nudge really is always just pushing the other person deeper into trouble because of their own naivete or whatever it is. But most people I see don't take the proper steps to address their problem. They take the gas can that was handed to them, set everybody on fire with it, and get canceled. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't real cases. Like I have in my family someone who is a high-level executive at a corporation. They have all these rules. And I said, has anyone really been canceled, at your work for having a bad opinion? And over the vaccine, one high-level executive did get pushed out of his job. But the way he conducted himself, the way that he didn't play ball according to the rules of the game as they exist, meant that he brought that upon himself. Now, conservatives might hear me say that and say, oh, that's a Democrat talking. No, I've been in this for a long time. We don't win anything because we just don't know how things work. And so this whole cancel culture, woke, walk off the deep end thing that we keep seeing, I'll stick by it. 99% of the time, it's someone who is encouraged to do their worst version of themselves. The normalization of the rant video, the guy who goes online and really brilliantly puts those in their place. And then that inspires us to be that too. And that's exactly what the system wants, because we get defeated. It's like walking into a wood chipper.
Well, I think that's a great example of what Scott Adams did with his comments about race a few weeks ago. And I thought, my God, he's too smart to have said something that was so ripe for ridicule that could be deconstructed or taken out of its context. But I think he wanted to go rogue, and I think he was trying to make a point. But I also think other times there are many other cases where it's an accident or it's not even remotely on purpose. Like I think of Morgan Wallen, who said the N-word, in a private situation. It was caught on video. It wasn't aimed at anyone of color. And his career collapsed for months, and he was able to build it back because he's talented. And I think his fans don't give a bleep about the unfairness of it all. I mean, I think they were kind of fighting back. But I understand what you're saying, and I think there are some provocateurs out there who lean into it aggressively. But I think a lot of times it's also just getting caught in a way that maybe people didn't expect, especially when it's the stuff you said 20 years ago. I think. Well,
who normalized it though? Who normalized cancel culture? Because it wasn't the people who were using their leverage and their rules to ruin the careers of other folks. Because look at the entertainment structure as exactly the same way as the government. It does not individually care about anybody. You just have to figure out where the story's going, where the paths of least resistance are, and if you get caught up in something like a high-paying job at a network, and they suddenly have an excuse that they can use to start getting rid of people, it's like you're walking around landmines. Yeah, that's like a self-cleansing part of the system that these people, you have to remember, they claw themselves to the top. There's nobody sitting at the top of show business that I think is a truly respectable person. There has to be a trail of bodies behind everybody that climbs that. And so I don't look at it as this tragedy of people getting canceled. My free speech has never been threatened. I still gather with my neighbors. Nothing has ever happened to me, but it's because I'm not in a big, powerful position working for a corporation that will use everything it can against me if it can. And we gave it permission.
We almost need to, once I hope this cultural moment passes, that we can step back and maybe in 20 years examine what allowed it to happen, and sort of the forces that stood down, the people that stood up, the people that reinforced the system, as it were. That's really amazing. I worked briefly for Andrew Breitbart at Breitbart News, and of course he famously said politics is downstream of culture, and I feel like many, many conservatives almost uniformly ignore that. I think Andrew Clavin is one who didn't, obviously Ben Shapiro, yourself certainly. I feel like there's also been a change here where conservatives are grasping that the culture does matter, and it matters in a significant way. You're seeing, Blaze TV just put out a new movie called Reopening, which was actually quite good, and they're getting into that space, and obviously the Daily Wire is doing what they're doing. Where do you see people right of center and the culture and politics, that sort of amalgam? Are they waking up at last, and what needs to happen next? Because it's obviously the mission is far from complete.
Well, I really think that this is an important point for people to dwell on, because you can't really argue with this fact. Since the time of Breitbart, and I knew Andrew as well, and I actually was one of the first bloggers that helped him launch Big Hollywood when it was just, that's all it was. And there was this mission, like we're gonna change the culture, and culture matters. That seems to have been siphoned away by con artists who have propped up a culture on the right that is all about politics. Mm-hmm. And so that, to me, that's the big cement shoes that we're wearing, and the left just pushes us off the edge every election cycle, and we sink to the bottom again and again. Because politics is not how people live their life. Politics is how right-wing influencers and people who are on the outs with the system or have been targeted by it at this time in history, conservative Americans, Christians, it's a reversal of just the same abuses the system has done in the past, to be on the opposite side of that and experience, all of these things means that politics failed. And the right is always talking about, well, we got a ballot. Everything is like, let's get good at ballot harvesting. Let's get good at the root of the tree, which is culture, which normalizes every behavior that then becomes a policy. And you're never going to beat those policies.
Can you give an example of maybe someone who's doing culture right now, putting out stories or videos or podcasts or films or anything of that ilk that you think is effective?
Well, I discovered a group of people that kind of loosely call themselves folk filmmakers. And these would be your teenage kid in the middle of anywhere who's making movies. One guy who I had on my podcast, his name is Daniel Lotz.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's made 500 movies. We're talking kids who take their iPhones out and really try to put on a Hollywood production. That Steven Spielberg in the backyard moment where he was, that's happening with high-tech equipment that is enabling these kids to get very, very close to something that's going to compete with theatrical entertainment. So the very small space, the least influenced by the narrative, the power, the media centers, are the people far from it who have the tools and the dreams. Mm-hmm. And they're going to tell stories. They're going to tell stories that are authentic and true. And those authentic, true stories must be embraced and adopted as part of the big tent, because those are the creators that have the biggest followings everywhere. They outnumber Hollywood movie stars. It's a real thing. These kids are aware that they have the power to tell stories to each other. And in every group of young people, there's somebody who's doing this.
Yeah.
And there's not enough jobs in Hollywood. And the agenda is just so narrow that it's just sitting right there. And those are the folks. And also the independent authors. I don't want to keep ranting on this, but independent creators of all kinds are the only ones who will tell the truth and save us through art.
Well, I think what's so interesting is that I'm not a rap music fan, but there's a new rap song that came out recently called Boycott Target. And guess where it came in the iTunes charts? Number one. Now, these are two rappers who have no media machine behind them. They've got no publicist. They're not getting any coverage in the press, certainly not favorable at this point. And they just caught something that was bubbling up in America, and they rose. I mean, I think that's just an amazing story. And it's one of the reasons why I rage against social media censorship, is because these artists that you're talking about, and they're often young, and they can be young, but they could be of any age, obviously. If they're censored, if they're diminished, if they're shadow banned, then their excitement and their passion and what they want to say, maybe that won't even get to the masses. So it's one of the things I've been fearing so much. And one of the reasons why I embrace Elon Musk's Twitter, warts and all, and he's not perfect, but he's certainly better than the last ownership regime. But
can I say something about this Target, these rappers in this video, because this is highly relevant. Look, every personality on the right that has a social media presence all began talking about Target at the exact same moment. Mm. That's a coordinated reiteration. It comes from on high, or it comes from some lateral place, and it spreads throughout the influence sphere. Okay. And then conservatives think they have something going. Now we've got something going. And then days later, how convenient, comes this rap video attacking Target. Now, the clothing that's on the shelves in Target is not there because of any other reason other than gay folks working with allies created a culture and a marketplace and consumers that mean there's people to buy those products. And so we on the right get duped. This is a professional duping, in my opinion, mm-hmm. a conning away from our own power to now root for these guys who are rapping against Target. It's so ironic to me. It's the wrong target. The target is actually the culture. And if culture really does have the power to normalize behavior, who normalized the instant reaction to the left as a way to get clicks and likes but change nothing? What I'm suggesting is that culture normalizes through story better interactions amongst the people, or better values, or things that more align with the worldview that you and I probably have that is quite similar. Mm-hmm. The movie Shane was made at a time when everybody supported the right to have a gun. It was a revered part of the culture. And Shane showed the little boy how to shoot a pistol. I mean, these movies have to get made again, mm-hmm. and they have to be made by the artists on our side who aren't so politicized that they think, here's how I'll show up the left. I'll print candy bars up that say he, her, right? That just makes that thing more powerful, and it makes us less heard and weaker.
I understand what you're saying. One thing, so is it just that we need to play a much longer game? Because when it comes to boycott, my I have no problem with gay people, but I have a significant issue with the trans movement looking to indoctrinate children who may be confused and maybe, held sway in this cultural wave. But, the song is addressing that anger and that frustration. And I don't think that's inconsequential. But you're saying there needs to be more than that, or that's like a Band-Aid in a sense. Is that?
I do think it is inconsequential. I think that it is the short game, and I love the baseball analogy. You probably see that I use it a lot. You and I are both baseball fans. I hate the Yankees. Okay. With that being said,
well, thanks for joining the show, Michael.
Yeah, no. With that being said, we absolutely have to play the long game. Mm-hmm. The long game is the only way to maintain a culture that maintains the values. Okay, the short game maintains that 5 minutes of fame, that 15 minutes of fame that Warhol said everyone would get. Now it's just monetized outrage and monetized reactions. People want to be taken somewhere. The aggravating part is if you and I come back 6 months from now and I revisit your podcast, nobody will know who those two rappers were. Mm-hmm. But the minute something happens to somebody who's been a cultural presence for years, singing songs about life and how much fun they have and partying, and then also being spotted with a politician, those two are going to rule everything because they're aligned and the people experience their life through that artist and that artist's stories. Yeah. Now, most people, the vast majority of people, just don't care about the issues that we're led to care too much about.
Yeah, I mean, I understand a lot of what you're saying, and I also think there's a hunger for clicks and instant gratification, which is really hard to fight. And I know for me, I run my own business, and if I write a story that maybe is not my best story, but it gets a lot of clicks and attention and sparks a conversation, then I'm whistling a tune in a sense, even though maybe it didn't do much of anything in the grand picture. I think we need to have you back at some point because I think there's a lot of stuff we can drill down to, and it's almost too much for just one conversation. But before I let you go, I want you to talk a little bit about your book. It's called Sub Pop Cult: The New Reiteration. It's considered a kind of a companion piece to your podcast, which we'll mention in a second as well. But give us a sneak peek at that and why it's important.
Well, what I do is I had honed down on how the media normalizes the habits that it wants us to have, and it's basically through reiteration. If you remember when they were attacking George Bush, you could turn on Will and Grace and there was a Bush joke. Mm-hmm. The commercial had a Bush joke. The news had a Bush joke, right? And this just went on. And I think that was the first time where they were like, let's test this new weaponized reiteration, since technology enables us to talk to everybody from everywhere all at once, right? Kind of ironic that that's the name of that popular movie and that's how it fits in. Mm-hmm. And so this is how it's pulled off. So I just said, you know what? I exist in reality. You exist in reality. We're both talking about on your show, a story. We just have to simply rewrite the story. So what I did is I made my podcast for 2 years, and then I took the best episodes and I transcribed them, and I made my podcast into a portable pulp paperback. And on the cover, I look like a left-wing, culture warrior, because I'm trying to demonstrate to our side that mocking the left means becoming the left and then pushing them off the edge. And we have to do that because that's kind of what they've done to us. So that's what you'll find in that book is the best essays, the best things I've ever said on my podcast that really, truly kind of articulate the nature of the game. I just want you to know that I love all the reactionary stuff too, and I participated in it for a long time. I call for, in my book and on my podcast, a need to pause that because we're not in a fair fight. Mm-hmm. Once we're back in a fair fight, let's all do politics again and go at it. But it's not a fair fight right now. It's a closed loop, and we exist in the right-wing echo chamber gulag. And it's been proven true since I launched my podcast, and we just keep losing elections.
Yeah. One quick note before I let you go. I speak to so many people, and when I bring up Andrew Breitbart's name, the response is often, oh, yeah, we met, or, yeah, he reached out to me, or he inspired me. It's just amazing the reach he has had over the years, and he's been gone for quite a while now. But Michael, thank you for joining the show. Like I said, I do want to have you back. I think there's other stuff we can drill down, and I think it's often complicated when we criticize our own side, but sometimes it can be necessary for sure. Of course, if you want to learn more about Michael, you can pick up the book, The New Reiteration, or check out his podcast, The Narrative with Michael McGruther. That's available on iTunes and other fine audio platforms. So, Michael, thank you so much, and we will talk again. And if the Yankees win this year, we'll get by. We'll get through.
Hey, I've got a rookie card that you like. I'll send it to you. All right.
Sounds good. Thanks again.
All right. I'll talk to you. Thank you very much.
You're listening to my dad's podcast. He cried like a baby watching Snoopy come home.
Caylan Ford's story just breaks my heart. The Canadian politician ran as a United Conservative Party candidate 4 years ago until somebody leaked private Facebook messages she had written and fed it to an activist press outlet. That's all it took. Her words were taken out of context, dramatically so, and they painted her as a white supremacist. Her campaign collapsed. She became persona non grata, and anyone who dared to air her side of the story or even just reach out to her, well, they got attacked too. Her life, in many ways, her public life, was over. And of course, try finding a job when you've been painted as a white supremacist. Just brutal. This is cancel culture at its absolute worst. A cocktail of lies and deception, and of course, media bias, which made everything so much worse. Well, now, Caylan's story can be seen in a really great documentary. It's called When the Mob Came, and it turns out that Caylan is a part-time documentary filmmaker. Well, that certainly worked to her advantage because now she can share her side of the story, which has been hidden for the last 4 years. The movie shares the awful details behind her cancellation, as well as how she survived such a brutal, unrelenting attack on her character. Can you imagine that? Being painted as a white supremacist when that's not remotely anything to do with your life and your philosophies. But her movie is the ultimate cancel culture expose, and it's really a must-see for that reason alone. I have to admit, on a personal level, if there's one reason why I wanted to get back into podcasting, is to speak to people like Caylan, because they matter, and more people should understand what she went through, because it could happen to any one of us. That is not hyperbole. Here's my conversation with Caylan Ford. Caylan, thank you for joining the show. I honestly, I've been looking forward to this conversation. I've been following your story. I really enjoyed the film, and I think it's so necessary. But you're a filmmaker. You've lived this incredible situation. The story needs to be told, but you're going to tell it, and you're going to relive it. And I'm sure, in the editing bay and going through the entire process and going through this again, did you consider stopping this, or maybe even questioning whether it was the right thing to do just because it was so painful the first time around?
Well, look, this project was very much born of necessity, because I don't think that I could have overcome the horror at engaging in so much really raw emotional self-disclosure otherwise. To me, it's a kind of self-indulgence that I find rather gauche, I guess. So it was a bit challenging, just the idea of it. But look, the situation that I found myself in post cancellation was that I had no way of earning a living, because the sort of destruction of my reputation was so extensive and so thorough that it was basically impossible for me to find new employment, and that remained the case for several years. And on the other hand, I also had no platform to tell the story. So I had a lot of media editors and journalists, friends of mine, who would tell me that they knew this narrative about me was false. They were afraid to publish me. They were afraid to say anything in my defense because of the sort of contaminating effect of guilt by association, or because they did not want to be subject to a mobbing themselves. So I had no platform and no way of earning a living. What I did have, though, was a background in documentary filmmaking. I'd previously made 2 documentaries that focused on themes related to totalitarianism, both about human rights issues in China. So dealing with things like censorship, mass persuasion, scapegoating, sort of, religious and political persecution. So, it was sort of a happy coincidence, not only that some of those themes were transferable, but that the experience and the connections were still there. And so I was able to get a little bit of seed funding to start making this documentary at a time when I had nothing else. And to the question of whether it's difficult reliving this, absolutely. But I think that we have a need to be able to make narrative sense of our lives. And so for me, this project was one way of trying to do that. And more importantly, the hardest thing about being canceled was that it left me with a feeling of uselessness. So it wasn't just the kind of practical challenges of how am I going to feed my family? How am I going to pay my mortgage? It wasn't just the sense of betrayal or the social isolation. It was the feeling of believing that I've been given gifts that are not for my own pleasure or comfort or sort of, self-aggrandizement, that any gifts that we're given are given to us that we might serve others. And so the most frustrating thing for me was that I felt like I was sort of locked up and put in a box and buried and had no means of contributing to the world. And so that's how I had to conceptualize this project in my mind, was that this is a way of trying to redeem the experience of suffering and hopefully to transmute it into something that might actually benefit other people.
Yeah.
To turn this experience itself into a vehicle for somehow giving back and to the world, I guess. That's how I had to think of it in my mind.
I can add nothing to that. I want to add two quick items, though. One, let's not gloss over the fact that there are journalists out there who don't want to share your perspective, don't want to share your story because of the fear of the blowback. I mean, this is journalism. You would think that they would want to tell a story, that they'd want to rally behind the underdog, someone who is grossly unfairly treated, but they're so cowardly and they're so beholden to the mob that they can't even do that. And I want to add a second thing. Let's just assume that the things that you said in those messages were accurate and fair, and even within the context were terrible. Let's just assume that, which is obviously not the case. In Hollywood, we just learned that Ezra Miller, whose track record of horrific behavior is legendary, is all speed ahead for another Flash movie, because if it's successful, they'll want to make a sequel. So someone who's done harm, physical harm and mental harm to multiple people over a short period of time doesn't suffer anything like a cancel culture attack. But if you had dark thoughts in one exchange, your career is over. I can't wrap my head around that. And it just really, to me, this is a bit of a soapbox, but it just exposes the folly of what cancel culture is. Because even if you think, well, it's trying to make the world a better place. Oh, it's trying to root out white supremacy. No, it's nonsense. It's all about power. And you got caught up in it. And that's horrible.
Yeah. And one definition of cancel culture is a failure to reason clearly in moral terms. No one is ever canceled for egregious crimes. It's very rare that people are canceled for doing things that are sort of actively, measurably harmful to anyone. What people are canceled for is typically, basically, for thinking the wrong thoughts, for transgressing not established norms, because all societies use sort of shame and hopefully ostracism, but in hopefully a rehabilitative way, but all societies use shame to police the boundaries of what is acceptable thought and speech and actions. The difference with cancel culture is that you're not policing and trying to enforce existing social norms. It's a vehicle of trying to change social norms through a quasi-coercive process, through intimidation and by terrorizing people and destroying their careers, and then making an example of them. So there's no persuasion. It's not a matter of dialogue. This is not critique or criticism. As I elaborate in the film, no one was ever interested in talking to me or persuading me, and I was very open to persuasion and to the possibility that I had erred. There was none of that. This was about trying to intimidate other people by making an example of me, a way of asserting power so as to forcibly change social norms. And they would actually say that a lot of the things that we would historically considered to be virtues, like charity, civility, a kind of intellectual openness, a preference for dialogue over coercion. The more sort of radical activists for social change would actually say that these norms themselves need to be destroyed, that these are sort of remnants of, inherited power structures, and they need to be dismantled, and we shouldn't be bound by a traditional sort of duty to truth or to charitable interpretations or to good faith, because those reinforce, systems of oppression or whatever.
It reminds me a little bit of, I've seen some films in recent years where they show it's often based on a true life story, bigoted characters, these heartless souls who see the error of their ways and who actually become better people and renounce their former hate. And often film critics, which I sadly, they're largely on the left side of the ideological landscape. They don't like those movies. They don't like that redemption. Which is, I don't know if it's an exact comparison, but it does remind me of that. But you said that you weren't able to tell your story. And one example in the film, which is so powerful, is that there was a radio show host who let you speak, who did have a conversation with you, and she was essentially hounded away from her job. Can you share some other examples of where you tried to speak out, you tried to share, hey, wait, this is my side of the story. Can I share this? But you weren't able to, because I imagine there are multiple examples.
Yeah, so the one that's in the film was probably the most dramatic example. I did a 40-minute interview with a radio host, and mainstream journalists, before this interview even aired, were going on Twitter basically saying that it was unethical to allow me a platform to defend myself. And then there was a petition launched against this host demanding apologies, threatening to target her advertisers. Now, if you listen to this interview, I think to all but the most committed ideologues, it was completely exculpating. And I think that's why they hated it.
Yeah.
Because they need a monster, because having a monster is what provides them with a sense that they must be on the side of the right. So if their monsters turn out to be not as bad as they thought, this is really disappointing. But there were other examples. So I had done sort of contemporaneous to that. I'd done 2 other interviews on sort of smaller podcasts. Same thing. Both of them were intimidated, threatened with legal action until they took the interviews offline. There was a National Post reporter, it's one of the big national papers in Canada, who I think made 3 separate attempts to publish an investigative feature. And each time it was either the edit, his bosses were afraid, or there were legal complications or whatever. So it just never materialized. I had tried writing op-eds and sort of personal narrative explaining my perspective. Usually op-ed editors wouldn't even get back to me. And I'm a pretty talented op-ed writer, so I don't think that it was necessarily that my writing was deficient. I think it's that my byline was something they just didn't want to have to deal with. So for me, it felt very much like, I remember distinctly the feeling of having been buried alive and kind of trying to claw my way back to the surface, only to have people sort of heap more dirt on me and sort of keep me down. And so that's a very frustrating experience, to witness lies about you in the world and to have no platform and no means to say what was true. And it imposes a great burden on the soul too, because I think that we naturally want our own inner perception of reality to align with what the outside world is telling us. We're social beings, right? We rely on social validation even for our understanding of what's real and what's true. And so it creates tremendous pressure when you have your own internal sense of who you are, what you believe, and the world around you is insisting that you believe something different. And it creates a massive amount of dissonance that's very difficult to reconcile or to accept that it can't be reconciled.
I think what's amazing about your story in part is that if someone were accused or caught saying something ugly or ignorant, I would think that if you're a journalist, the first instinct would be, oh gosh, maybe that person has a history of these actions, these thoughts. Maybe I'll, comb through the records and see if he or she had displayed that arrogance, that ignorance before. I get the sense that there was none of that. There was, not that it just didn't exist, which it didn't, it appears, but the fact there was no attempt. It's like if someone says something terrible, all of a sudden their entire life up until that second is wiped out. And then they're basically reborn as this hateful person, when maybe their life reflects none of that. That just seems staggering to me as a journalist, that they would ignore that.
Yeah. So in my case, I think it was there was an absurdity to it. I was basically accused of, sympathizing with white supremacist terrorism and by implication hating immigrants and hating Muslims. Now, I had spent my entire life, certainly my entire adult life, but since I was about 16, doing enormous amounts of volunteer work with members of persecuted minorities, with people who working with asylum seekers. I was an expert witness on multiple asylum seekers in their hearings. I've on the public record, I've advocated for more generous refugee resettlement policies.
You're quite the monster. Continue, but
I think actually the thing, like the day that this story broke, the thing that was at the top of my Twitter timeline was me delivering in Mandarin a New Year's greeting to the Chinese community in the constituency where I was running. So no one ever managed to find anything in the public record that would support these accusations at all, which led to some rather amusing conspiracy theories that I must have somehow scrubbed all of the.
As horrible as this story is, Caylan, there's a farcical element that if we could distance ourselves from the horrors of it, that actually would be like a great satirical comedy. But there's just too much pain involved, obviously. But it's that bizarre. I know I've followed filmmakers in the recent past who have tried to tell stories that are, I'd say, inconvenient on several subjects, and they face consequences or they face obstacles that are, you're a filmmaker, there's always, hard to raise money. You gotta, the shoot's going to go awry because the weather goes bad, those kind of things. Did you encounter any obstacles along the way for this film, either the creation of or the distribution that were unique or unexpected?
Well, we started production in 2019, and by early 2020, COVID hit.
Right.
So production was delayed for quite a long time. The process of getting this project insured was enormous. If you watch the film, you'll understand why. Every word seems like a defamation risk, and so we had to have lawyers combing through every single sentence, looking for and provide them with court documents and other forms of documentary proof, because without that, there are some of the events that transpire in this just can't be believed unless you actually have the proof sitting in front of you. So it took a really long time to persuade the insurance underwriters and the entertainment lawyers to clear this film. But then in distribution, it's again, no local media covered the release of this film, even in the midst of an election where it would presumably be very salient. It's all of the big characters. And the independent theaters that we first approached about doing a live screening, when they learned the content, balked and backed out, and were reluctant. They didn't want to court any controversy by screening a film that sort of dealt with cancel culture type issues. It certainly feels like the institutional powers that be are not really interested in this project, with one notable exception, which is that the project got seed funding from the Canada Media Fund, which is typically critiqued as being very sort of progressive, but actually, for the most part, they just try to support good Canadian content creators. So, props to them there.
In America, there is this whole blossoming industry. It's generically center-right for sure, but it's platforms that are trying to give people a voice when they're held down. It's people who have been canceled who are given a second chance. The Daily Wire comes to mind. I'm a contributor there, just for full disclosure. Have you considered, cracking the U.S. market, not just through the places we'll share in a moment about where you can see the film, but maybe partnering with one of those groups and getting a wider distribution potentially?
Look, if the Daily Wire wants to get the licensing rights to the film, give me a call.
Right.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, yeah. Now, talk about the reaction to the film so far. Anything? I mean, I could go on and on about my reaction. I think you know what it is essentially, and it's not a surprise. But have there been unexpected reactions? Maybe people reaching out to you, people assuming your story was X, but then realizing it wasn't that at all. Anything like that so far?
Yeah, so there have been some responses that are very heartening. A few people who've said that they participated in the pylon initially, and that this caused them to realize the human face of that is the target of these actions. So, I mean, I think this is a good film. I would hope it's a good film, not just if you're already critical of cancel culture and you want to feel vindicated in your opposition to it. I don't just mean to sort of flatter people who are already on my side. I would like this film to be watched by people who, A, don't believe that cancel culture is real, or who think that it's just about imposing just consequences on, powerful people who otherwise you can't hold accountable or something. And I hope that it would be watched by people who've participated in sort of online shaming campaigns and deplatforming campaigns. And it's possible that people may not have even realized that they've done that because the barrier to participation is so low, right? You don't have to physically pick up a stone and throw it at a human being whose face you can see. You just have to say a few words on Twitter or whatever and send out a tweet, and you never think about it again. And so I hope that this puts a human face on that process and shows you what the impact of that is on people's lives. So I've been heartened to have received a few responses like that. Unexpectedly for me, I actually feel like there is something about, just as human beings, about being able to share our experiences and our suffering with other people that somehow lessens it. So I wasn't expecting that reaction.
Yeah.
I think over the years I had tried to steel myself against public opinion of any form and try to make myself impervious to it. But I actually have been very touched by the kindness of people who've seen the film and who've sort of shared in that experience with me. I worry a little bit that part of the core thesis has not come through, because a lot of people watch the film and they're outraged, and they're upset at cancel culture, and they're upset at the cowardice of people who don't stand up to it, and all of this. And the actual thesis that I really wanted to convey, but maybe didn't do convincingly enough, is yes, this experience is awful. It's hard to overstate how awful it is, but it is not the worst fate that can befall a person. And that when it comes down to it, suffering, whether justly or unjustly, is not necessarily bad for us when you take a long enough view. You talked about the idea of tragedy and comedy being one and the same, which and I very much feel that way. But also, suffering can have some redemptive purpose, and it can be turned to the good. And far worse than suffering unjustly is doing injury to others, is failing to live by your principles, not being able to live with integrity, and participating in the injury of other people. In the long run, certainly in the next life, but even in this life, I think those things are actually worse for us and are a more difficult burden to live with.
I'm going to shift gears rather violently because I'm hoping there's I'm hoping for the answer on this question is helps with what's going on. But you've sued some of the media companies that have been distorting what happened. And I know these things are very fraught because the burden of proof is significant. And I know Nick Sandmann in the U.S. had some good success against some of the corporations and media outlets that basically lied about his appearance on the Capitol a couple of years ago. That's another story for another day. But can you share any update on this process? Is there any hope there?
Yeah, so Canada's defamation laws are in some ways actually more favorable to plaintiffs than the US. So the cost awards tend to be less, but in big cases. But I've brought a defamation claim against a number of major Canadian news outlets, as well as the political entities that sort of orchestrated this. I would characterize it as a smear campaign. We're 3 years into it and hoping to conclude discovery this year.
Wow.
So it's a protracted process. It's an expensive process. One of the perverse things about having your reputation and your ability to earn a living so severely impacted is if you then want to try to rehabilitate your reputation, it may take a decade and like $500,000 in legal fees. But I think it's a necessary process. The proponents of cancel culture will say, as I alluded to earlier, they'll say there's no such thing as cancel culture. This is just about consequences. To which my response is, I also believe in consequences. And I think there should be consequences for falsely, frivolously making life-destroying accusations against someone for your own personal advantage. And the consequences should not be that you have a mob aroused against you. It should be that you have to answer for that in a court of law. So I think it's necessary that one of the ways you can fight back against cancel culture, beyond doing the kind of inner work of trying to be a more just, charitable, courageous person, is to hold them accountable through the legal process and to impose costs on people who participate in these kinds of things.
I think the biggest irony of your entire situation is I'm not sure there could be anyone who was more well-versed in these totalitarian tactics and more eloquent on the entire situation, and that same person was canceled in the most vigorous and unfair way possible. It's one of the most amazing parts of your story. Caylan, thank you for joining the show and, of course, sharing your story and being brave. And if there is one profound benefit from your horrible story is that many, many more people may learn about cancel culture and hopefully turn against it. The movie is When the Mob Came. It's available right now on Vimeo.com, or you can go to whenthemobcame.com. It'll lead you right to where it needs to go. Either way, you'll be shaken and upset and outraged as I was, but I'm really glad I saw it, and I hope many, many more people see it and share it on social media, share it around. And, we're not all movie distributors or promotion experts, but we all can do a little something to make this story go bigger, and that's absolutely vital. Caylan, thank you so much, and keep us abreast of everything that's going on with your story as things move on.
Thank you.
All right, it's time for the weekly tip. Everybody's going Hollywood these days. Fox Nation, The Daily Wire. We talked to Lure TV a couple of episodes ago. I believe that was episode 167. Well, now it's Blaze TV's turn. Yes, that's Glenn Beck's enterprise, and it's getting into the movie game. Now, the new film is called Reopening, and it's a bit of an update on the Waiting for Guffman style of mockumentary. You remember that movie that was making fun of, in a sweet way, the small town theater group and all the behind-the-scenes antics. Well, this is similar, except it was set during the COVID lockdown era. And this particular theatrical troupe, a very small group of people, well, they want to put on a show. But they can't because the lockdowns are in place and they've got to follow all these different rules and regulations. But the show must go on, right? Of course, Reopening mocks all those insane, nonsensical lockdown measures, but it does it in a very subtle way. It's not wagging a finger at us. It's not lecturing the audience. It's just poking holes in it bit by bit and letting the audience connect all the different dots. It's a great way to approach the material, and this is really funny stuff, consistently so. Yes, the egos on display here are pretty comical. They are very vulnerable to even the slightest critique. But you know what? It's enjoyable, engaging, and you really do feel for these characters. The film has a bit of a sentimental side toward the end. Not going to give away anything more than that, but a movie is working and firing in all cylinders when the sentimental moments bubble up and you really care about the characters and what happens next. It's also clean, too, that there is a few bits of profanity here, but they're bleeped out, and it's actually a more comic extension of the film itself. So don't mind that. You can watch it with everyone in your family, and I think you're going to get a kick out of it. Now, Blaze TV did not invent or create this movie. I believe it was out there. They invested in it. They brought it under their paywall. It's a wise choice. Reopening is smart, it's funny, it's clever, and it's a good way for Blaze TV and Glenn Beck to get into the movie business. I'm pretty curious to see what they do next. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you to Radio America for having me as part of their great podcast lineup. And by the way, if you're not listening to Mock and Daisy on the Chicks on the Right podcast, you are missing a great, funny, silly, wacky show. So smart, so good. Fix that right away. Go subscribe to that show. Of course, after you subscribe to ours. Also, I would love if you checked out HollywoodInToto.com. That is my home base, updated daily. And you know what? 4 to 5 dentists recommend it for a brighter smile. See you next time.